And these numbers are the numbers we find back in the shelter manuals. So we were questioning a little bit about, are these guidebooks and manuals actually, in touch with the reality of what's going on in these kind of situations? So going back and looking at these comparative field studies, we look at impact. Impact, of course, being risk versus vulnerability. Now, the different kind of, let's say, things that can create that vulnerability: land movement, earthquake, landslides, volcanoes, we know, water abundance, floods and tsunamis, and weather cyclones and typhoons. So this was basically the areas that we found apparent in all the different case studies. Secondly, there's a kind of impact that's dealing with this slum or farmer or potential person who's going to be at risk in here, which on the one hand has to do with just a large issue which is taking place long before a disaster takes place, which you can call a slow disaster or more of a man-made disaster, is this idea of land scarcity push. So the lack of land resources drives actually to unplanned and vulnerable urbanization. So you actually get on the one hand, and this goes very much in contact with this livelihood pull, the attraction to disaster-prone areas. So people are actually being pushed out of their urban rural areas because of land developments that are taking place. So less land for, let's say, well-infrastructured agricultural production, which actually forces them as an economic refugee to move elsewhere. And the elsewhere that they move to, and that's the livelihood pull, is into the city, where they know there's a lot of economic activity taking place. The problem is that they don't enter the city through the front door. They're not even welcomed by the city. So they're entering the city through the back door, and they're trying to find within this urban formal system ways of inhabitation, ways of economic development, ways of building their own habitation. And the only spaces that they have are the leftover residual spaces, which are spaces that are left over for very clear reasons. Either because they're highly vulnerable, they're toxic, for whatever reasons that is, these are uninhabited spaces that these people have to end up moving into. So then you also get, as a third, as a last mechanism, you get either within this issue of resilience, you either get risk reduction programs, so that's a formal kind of response mechanism. So let's say you can call disaster preparedness that an institution or an organization or a country might install. And secondly, which is more, let's say, the more everyday, what we find, is the emerging coping mechanisms that are being handled with, and let's say tactics that individuals themselves are putting together. So you see here, basically in the case of Venezuela, there was a very big impact there of a landslide that took place, which was one very big impact moment that affected a big region. The case of El Salvador is a little bit mixed. You've got, on the one hand, an earthquake-prone area. At the same time, you've got landslides. At the same time, you've got hurricanes moving in the region. In the case of Bangladesh, very intense, and basically the Southeast Asian area is one of the most diverse areas as far as different kind of risk and vulnerability aspects of dealing with, because you have here a frequency which you see is much higher than, for example, once in a 10 or 50 year landslide or earthquake. Here you basically, in Indonesia, we had a huge tsunami which hit. In the case of Bangladesh, you have both tsunamis as well as floods and typhoons that are passing through the area. Thirdly, on Philippines, Philippines seems to be like the mecca of disasters. They have every potential disaster you can have, from volcanoes to earthquakes, to floods, to windstorms, to landslides. Everything takes place there, and it takes place every month. You'll see that later on the time frame. In the case of Ghana, it's actually very slow. It actually works also more on the regional scale as far as the entire nation. You've got big droughts which take place in the north, people migrating to the city, and then big floods in the city because they're sitting next to the river or fires, and then they move back to the regional area. But you'll see that when I go more into the case studies themselves. This is a bit of a quick intro. I don't even know how I'm doing the time. So maybe I should just check that, because I don't think I'm going to get near to finishing this thing. Okay. Okay, then the second issue was, important issue was time frame. As I just mentioned, frequency and intensity. So there is singular versus seasonal. So seasonal would be, for example, in the case of Haiti or the Caribbean region or the Southeast region in Asia, where you have seasonal, basically hurricanes or typhoons that are passing through, that are creating slowly by slowly a kind of a culture that is disaster oriented. Whereas, for example, in New Orleans, which got hit by a disaster, it happened 30 years ago, so they don't even think about it until it happens 30 years again. Recurrent disaster generates, basically, as I said, a state of emergency. So people are living in a very stateful and basically flexible and adaptable living system. The entire urban system becomes responsive because they don't know what's happening. They don't know what will be the next effect, and they don't know how they're going to have to deal with it, but they have, let's say, an experience through the past. So basically disaster preparedness during redevelopment. So this is constantly basically being engraved in them. Single event disaster generated basically a direct emergency. Of course, large impact on death and destruction on the environment, especially also but high visibility in international interest, which is of course the financial aspect to it. Because Philippines is getting right now as we speak hit by something, I can assure you. But there's no big news article about it. You don't even know about it until it has to kind of go beyond a certain threshold of interest, and then maybe we'll hear about it. Whereas Haiti, when it gets hit, it gives global visibility. And we learned a few years ago in 2005 with the tsunami that with such a big event, how much of global money came together. We're talking 7 billion euros was put together to respond to the tsunami disaster. 9 billion euro has been put together to respond to the Haiti disaster. So these are phenomenal numbers which Philippines will never get their hands on, because even though they're dealing with similar disasters on a high frequency. So you get a frequency of disaster versus phase redevelopment. Fast redevelopment versus delayed redevelopment, which is also one of the things that when you get hit by a disaster, your whole development of the country, the nation, is set back. Sometimes 5 years, sometimes 10 years, sometimes more. In the case of Haiti, we all know that the earthquake disaster has hit Haiti back. Just two things to know about Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, as it is now. Through this earthquake, they have been hit back on their development 20 years. So in 20 years from today, they are back to where they are now, as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So if you just think about the entire urban system trying to move somewhere, what such a big impact actually has to its entire development cycle. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit faster to this. So we, as I said, a time frame on Venezuela with the big landslides here. These are basically evolutionary maps, which are showing basically big disasters over the past times. You can see in El Salvador the frequency is higher. Bangladesh basically, I'm not going to go too much. The tsunami here was a one-time big impact. I mean, there are other things taking place in Indonesia, but for sure the tsunami was of a global event. As I said, Philippines, you can see, I mean, every day there's something going on. And Ghana, which is a much more gradual approach. Another big comparative thing that we want to look at was aid. So looking here basically at what's taking place on this international monetary and humanitarian response. So where's the money, what are they doing, what kind of decisions are they making, and what is actually some of the underlying struggles that they're dealing with. Now, we've got a vicious cycle of development. So natural disaster obstructs development in developing countries, what I just mentioned, that you're set back basically 10 to 20 years at the moment of being hit by a disaster. Maybe a good example which I can share with you, which was not one of our own examples, which I heard from the UN Habitat group, was that you can imagine that a country gets a loan from IMF to put together a vast infrastructure over the hills to get water from some area back into the city, or electrical lines, or whatever it is. Some big investment that they had to borrow, a couple of billion euros or dollars to do this. Now, they make this design and they put it together, but 3 years later the area gets hit by an earthquake. And there's no risk assessment that has been made within the IMF development. So they don't normally, the IMF, put a risk assessment in the development plans that they have. As a result, not only is the entire infrastructure broken, but the country which had to take a loan from the IMF now also is in a double debt. So they've lost their infrastructure and they have to continue paying this debt off for the next 20 years. So it's because of this kind of double scenario that IMF was realizing that they're giving all these loans, but they're not really doing a well criteria to it, that in 2001, the UN set up a GRIP program, G-R-I-P, which basically is doing risk assessment analysis for the UNDP. So before any money is spent now,